Sarah's boots crunched against the dried autumn leaves as she stumbled forward, her wrists bound tightly with coarse rope behind her back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the oak trees surrounding the remote ranch, and fear coursed through her veins like ice water. She had been walking for what felt like hours, guided by the firm hand of Jake Morrison, a man whose reputation in these parts was as vast as his sprawling cattle ranch. 3 days earlier, Sarah had arrived in the small town of Cedar Ridge as a journalist investigating reports of missing hikers in the area. The local sheriff had been less than helpful, dismissing her questions with barely concealed irritation. But it was Jake Morrison's name that kept coming up in hushed conversations at the diner and gas station. People spoke of him in whispers, describing a man who kept to himself on his 1,000-acre property, someone who didn't take kindly to strangers wandering onto his land. Sarah had ignored the warnings. She was determined to uncover the truth behind the disappearances, convinced that someone in this tight-knit community was hiding something important. Her editor back in Denver had given her 2 weeks to either find a story or return empty-handed. She wasn't about to give up after just a few days of dead ends. The mistake had been simple but costly. Sarah had decided to explore the hiking trails that bordered Morrison's property, thinking she might find clues the local authorities had overlooked. She had been careful to stay on public land, but the trail markers were old and faded. Without realizing it, she had crossed onto private property and continued hiking deeper into the wilderness. That's when she heard the gunshot. The sharp crack echoed through the trees, causing birds to scatter from their perches. Sarah's heart hammered as she froze in place, unsure which direction the sound had come from. Before she could decide whether to run or hide, she heard the heavy footsteps approaching through the underbrush. Jake Morrison emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees, a hunting rifle cradled in his arms. He was exactly as Sarah had imagined from the descriptions she'd heard. Tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent working outdoors. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and his blue eyes held an intensity that made Sarah take an involuntary step backward. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice low and gravelly. There was no anger in his tone, just a matter-of-fact statement that somehow made the situation even more frightening. Sarah tried to explain herself, stammering about being lost and accidentally crossing property lines. But Jake's expression remained unchanged as he listened to her words. When she finished speaking, he simply nodded and gestured with the rifle for her to start walking. "Where are you taking me?" Sarah asked, but Jake didn't answer. He just kept walking behind her, occasionally giving directions to turn left or right as they made their way deeper into the forest. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the distant lowing of cattle. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. She thought about the missing hikers, about the stories she'd heard in town. Was Jake Morrison responsible for their disappearances? Was she about to become another statistic? As they walked, Sarah tried to memorize landmarks that might help her find her way back if she got the chance to escape. She noticed an old windmill in the distance, a creek that babbled nearby, and several distinctive rock formations. But, with each step, they seemed to be moving further away from any chance of rescue. The rope around her wrists chafed against her skin, and Sarah could feel her hands beginning to go numb from the tight binding. She wanted to ask Jake to loosen the rope, but something about his demeanor warned her against speaking unless absolutely necessary. There was a coiled tension about him, like a rattlesnake ready to strike at the slightest provocation. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing where an enormous oak tree stood alone, its massive trunk scarred by years of weather and its branches spreading wide overhead. Jake stopped walking and Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized what she was seeing. Rope hung from one of the lower branches. Her knees nearly buckled as the implications hit her. This was it. This was where Jake Morrison had brought the other hikers. This was where their stories had ended, and where hers was about to end as well. Sarah's breathing became shallow and rapid as panic began to set in. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have a family. I have people who care about me." Jake didn't respond. He approached the hanging rope and began examining it, testing its strength with sharp tugs. The rope appeared to be well maintained, as if it had been used recently. Sarah's stomach churned as she watched him work. The wind picked up, causing the oak's leaves to rustle overhead with a sound like whispered warnings. Sarah found herself thinking about her sister back in Denver, about the nieces and nephews she might never see again. She thought about all the stories she would never write, all the adventures she would never have. Jake finished his inspection of the rope and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, giving no hint of what he was thinking or planning. Sarah braced herself for what was coming next, closing her eyes and trying to find some measure of peace in what might be her final moments. But, instead of the violence she expected, she heard Jake's voice, quiet but clear in the stillness of the clearing. "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Sarah opened her eyes, surprised by the unexpected calmness in Jake's voice. She had prepared herself for threats or violence, but instead found herself looking at a man who seemed almost concerned. The contradiction between her expectations and reality left her momentarily speechless. Jake set his rifle against the base of the oak tree and pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. 3 weeks ago, I found this nailed to my front gate, he said, holding up the paper so Sarah could see the crude handwriting scrawled across it. "It's a ransom note." Sarah squinted, trying to read the message from her position several feet away. The words were barely legible, written in what appeared to be black marker. "We have your daughter. Follow our instructions or she dies." "Your daughter?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from fear and confusion. Jake's jaw tightened. "Emma. She's 16. Was supposed to come visit me for her fall break from boarding school back east. Never made it." He folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket. The note came with a photo of her tied up and a list of demands. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind, though the picture they formed was nothing like what she had expected. "The missing hikers," she said slowly. "They weren't random disappearances." "No," Jake confirmed. "They were journalists and private investigators, just like you. All of them came here asking questions, getting too close to something they shouldn't have been investigating." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "The difference is, you're the first one who actually found me." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to the others?" "They're alive, as far as I know. But they're being held somewhere, along with Emma." Jake's voice took on a harder edge. "Whoever is behind this has been very clear about what will happen if I don't cooperate. Every time someone comes looking into the disappearances, I'm supposed to capture them and turn them over." "But you haven't," Sarah observed, noting that she was still standing in the clearing rather than being handed off to unknown captors. Jake shook his head. "I've been stalling, trying to figure out who's really behind this. The instructions come through different methods each time. Sometimes it's a note left at a specific location, sometimes it's a phone call to my landline from a blocked number. Whoever is doing this is smart enough to cover their tracks." The rope hanging from the oak branch took on a different meaning now. "This is where you're supposed to bring them," Sarah said. "The instructions always say to tie them to this tree and wait. Someone comes to collect them, but I never see who it is. They wait until I'm gone, then take whoever I've left here." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "I've tried hiding in the woods to watch, but they're too careful. They must have a way of knowing when I'm nearby." Sarah's journalistic instincts kicked in despite her fear. "How many people have been taken?" "6, counting Emma. 5 others before you showed up." Jake ran a hand through his graying hair. "I've been going crazy trying to figure out how to get them back without getting them all killed." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Why not just follow the instructions like you have before?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the rope swaying in the breeze. "Because I think you might be the key to solving this. You're a real journalist, not just some amateur detective or curious hiker. You have resources, contacts, ways of investigating that I don't. But if you don't turn me over, won't they hurt Emma?" "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But they're going to hurt her anyway, eventually. These people, whoever they are, they're not planning to let any of their captives go. They've been demanding more and more from me each time, pushing to see how far they can control me. It's only a matter of time before they decide they don't need leverage anymore." Sarah's mind was racing. The story she had come here to investigate was bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. What kind of demands have they been making? Jake hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Money, mostly. They started small, asking for 10,000 here, 20,000 there. Made it seem like they just wanted cash and would let Emma go. But then, they started asking for other things. What kind of other things? Information about other ranchers in the area. Property records, financial documents, personal details about families. Jake's expression darkened. Someone is gathering intelligence for a reason, and it's not just about money. The implications sent a shiver through Sarah. You think this is part of something larger? I know it is. But I can't figure out what, and I can't go to the authorities without risking Emma's life. Jake picked up his rifle and checked the safety. That's where you come in. Sarah felt a surge of determination mixed with terror. What do you want me to do? Help me find them. Use your connections, your investigative skills, whatever resources you have access to. We need to locate where they're holding the captives before they realize I'm not playing by their rules anymore. And if we can't find them in time? Jake's blue eyes met hers, and she saw a depth of desperation there that made her heart ache. Then, I'll have failed as a father, and 7 innocent people will pay the price for my inability to protect them. The weight of the situation settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. She thought about her editor back in Denver, about the story she had originally come here to write. This was so much bigger than missing hikers or small-town corruption. This was organized crime, kidnapping, possibly even murder. The rope, Sarah said suddenly. If you untie me and I help you, how will you explain it when they come looking for me? Jake smiled grimly. I've been thinking about that. We fake your death. Make it look like you tried to escape, fell into the creek, and drowned. Your body gets washed away, never to be found. Will they believe that? They'll have to. It's either that or they'll know I'm not cooperating anymore. Jake began untying the rope around Sarah's wrists. The question is, are you willing to take that risk? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back. You'll be officially dead, and we'll be on our own against whoever is behind this. Sarah felt the circulation returning to her hands as the rope fell away. She rubbed her wrists, considering the enormous decision in front of her. She could insist that Jake take her back to town, report everything to the authorities, and hope they could handle the situation without getting the captives killed. Or she could trust this stranger and help him attempt a rescue that could easily get them all killed. But, as she looked into Jake's eyes and saw the desperate love of a father willing to risk everything for his daughter, Sarah knew what choice she had to make. Tell me exactly what we need to do. The plan they devised was both simple and terrifying in its implications. Jake would report to his mysterious contacts that Sarah had attempted to escape during transport to the oak tree. According to their fabricated story, she had broken free while crossing the creek and fallen into the fast-moving water during the struggle. Her body had been swept downstream and disappeared, presumed drowned. To make the story believable, Sarah would have to disappear completely from her normal life. No contact with her editor, her family, or anyone else who might compromise the illusion of her death. Jake offered her shelter in an old hunting cabin deep in his property, a place so remote that even his ranch hands rarely visited it. The cabin sat in a narrow valley surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by an overgrown trail that wound through miles of wilderness. It had been built by Jake's grandfather decades earlier and maintained just enough to serve as an emergency shelter during harsh weather. The structure was solid but basic, with a wood-burning stove, a hand-pumped well, and oil lamps for light. Sarah's first night in the cabin was the longest of her life. Every sound from the forest made her jump, convinced that their deception had been discovered and armed men were coming to finish what they had started. But, as dawn broke through the small windows, she began to feel a cautious optimism. If Jake was right about the kidnappers' patterns, they wouldn't expect another journalist to arrive for at least several weeks. Jake visited the cabin daily, always taking a different route and carefully checking for signs that he might have been followed. He brought supplies, food, and, most importantly, updates on their investigation. Together, they began piecing together a picture of what was really happening in Cedar Ridge. The pattern that emerged was more sophisticated than either of them had initially realized. The disappearances weren't random, and they weren't simple kidnappings for ransom. Someone was systematically targeting people who might uncover a larger conspiracy involving land acquisition and resource rights in the area. Sarah's journalistic training proved invaluable as they analyzed the information Jake had gathered. She recognized patterns in the demands that suggested the kidnappers had inside knowledge of local government operations. They knew too much about property values, zoning regulations, and upcoming development projects for this to be the work of outsiders. Someone on the County Planning Commission is involved, Sarah concluded after reviewing Jake's notes for the third time. These aren't random demands for cash. They're asking for specific information that would be valuable to someone planning major land acquisitions. Jake nodded grimly. I came to the same conclusion. But that's a pretty small group of people, and most of them have been in their positions for years. They're all respected members of the community. Which makes them perfect cover for something like this, Sarah pointed out. Think about it. Who would suspect the county commissioner or the head of the planning department of masterminding kidnappings? Their investigation took on new urgency when Jake received another communication from the kidnappers. This time, instead of demands for money or information, the message was a warning. They claimed to know that the latest captive had escaped and drowned but expressed suspicion about the circumstances. Jake was given 48 hours to provide proof of Sarah's death, or there would be consequences for all the hostages. They want a body, Jake said grimly as he shared this latest development with Sarah. Or at least proof that you're actually dead. Sarah felt her blood run cold. What kind of proof? The message wasn't specific, but I think they want me to find your remains and bring them evidence. A piece of clothing, personal effects, something that proves you didn't just run away. They both understood what this meant. Their time was running out much faster than they had hoped. If they couldn't produce convincing evidence of Sarah's death within 2 days, the kidnappers would likely assume Jake was no longer cooperating. The consequences for Emma and the other captives would be swift and final. That evening, as they sat in the cabin planning their next move, Sarah made a decision that surprised them both. We need to stage a recovery of my body. Jake looked at her as if she had lost her mind. That's impossible. Even if we could create something convincing enough to fool them up close, how would we explain finding your remains so quickly? We don't find them, Sarah explained. Someone else does. Someone who has no connection to you, who would have a legitimate reason to be searching the creek. The plan that emerged was risky but potentially brilliant. Sarah would contact her editor in Denver using Jake's secure landline, carefully wording her message to suggest she was in danger but without revealing the truth about her situation. Her editor would then contact local authorities to report a missing journalist, triggering a search and rescue operation. During that search, Jake would plant evidence along the creek bank. Sarah's backpack, torn and waterlogged as if it had been caught in the current for days. Her notebook, with pages missing and the remaining entries smeared beyond readability. Most convincingly, her press credentials, damaged but still identifiable. The timing had to be perfect. The evidence needed to be discovered by legitimate searchers who would report the find through official channels. The kidnappers would hear about it the same way everyone else in the small community would, through the local grapevine and police scanner chatter. Sarah made the call to her editor on the morning of the deadline, speaking carefully and choosing her words to create the right impression without saying anything that was technically untrue. She reported that her investigation had uncovered something significant but dangerous, and that she was concerned for her safety. If her editor didn't hear from her within 24 hours, he should contact the local authorities. The call worked exactly as they had hoped. Within hours, Cedar Ridge was buzzing with news that search and rescue teams were being organized to look for the missing journalist. Volunteers came from surrounding counties, bringing boats and diving equipment to search the creek and river system. Jake planted the evidence just before dawn, carefully positioning Sarah's belongings where they would be found by the search teams, but not so obviously that it would appear staged. He then joined the search himself, playing the role of a concerned local citizen helping to look for the missing woman. The discovery came late in the afternoon. A volunteer searcher found Sarah's backpack caught in a fallen tree branch about 2 miles downstream from where Jake had reported the drowning. Within an hour, the rest of the evidence had been located and the official conclusion was reached. Sarah Martinez, journalist from Denver, had died in an accidental drowning while investigating the disappearances in Cedar Ridge. But, even as their deception succeeded, Sarah and Jake realized they had gained only a temporary reprieve. The kidnappers might be satisfied with the evidence of her death, but they still had Emma and 5 other innocent people. And, now, with the authorities officially closing the case on Sarah's investigation, there would be even less outside attention focused on finding the missing captives. As night fell and the search teams departed, Sarah sat in the remote cabin feeling more isolated than ever. She was officially dead, cut off from everything and everyone she had ever known. Her only ally was a desperate rancher who was running out of time to save his daughter. But she had learned something important during the day's events. When Jake had joined the search for her body, he had overheard conversations between some of the volunteers that revealed new information about the conspiracy. Comments about property development projects, mentions of investors from out of state, and references to meetings that weren't part of any official county business. The kidnappers weren't just after ransom money or local intelligence. They were part of something much larger, something that involved transforming the entire character of Cedar Ridge. And, now that Sarah was officially dead and no longer a threat to their timeline, they were about to accelerate their plans. The race to save Emma and the other captives had become a race to prevent an entire community from being destroyed by forces they didn't even know existed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While hiding in the cabin, Sarah had been monitoring local radio frequencies with an old scanner Jake had brought her. Most of the chatter was routine emergency services communication, but late one evening she picked up a conversation on a private frequency that made her blood run cold. 2 men were discussing the timeline for Phase 2 of their operation. One voice Sarah didn't recognize, but the other belonged to someone she had interviewed just days before her supposed death. County Commissioner Harold Barnes, a man who had seemed genuinely concerned about the missing hikers and had promised to cooperate fully with any investigation. The conversation revealed that the kidnappers were planning to move their captives to a new location within the next 48 hours. The current holding site had apparently been compromised in some way, though the details weren't clear from the radio transmission. More importantly, Sarah learned that the new location was an abandoned mine shaft about 30 miles east of Cedar Ridge. When Jake arrived the next morning with supplies, Sarah shared what she had discovered. His face went pale as she described Barnes' involvement in the conspiracy. "Harold Barnes has been my family's friend for over 20 years, Jake said, sinking into one of the cabin's worn chairs. "He was at Emma's baptism, her first birthday party. I trusted him completely." "That's exactly why he was perfect for this role," Sarah pointed out. "Who would suspect someone with such deep community ties? He probably has access to information about every major property transaction, every development project, every family's financial situation." Jake pulled out a map of the area and spread it on the cabin's small table. "The old Copper Creek mine," he said, pointing to a location in the mountains east of town. "It's been abandoned for 15 years, ever since the mineral rights played out. The access road is still maintained because the county uses some of the buildings for equipment storage. That would give Barnes a legitimate reason to visit the site," Sarah realized. He could check on county property while really overseeing the hostages. They spent the rest of the day planning what Jake knew was likely a suicide mission. The mine was in a remote location with limited access routes and plenty of places for guards to position themselves. Even if they could locate exactly where the captives were being held, extracting them without alerting the kidnappers would be nearly impossible. But Sarah had an idea that might give them an edge. "We don't try to sneak in and rescue them," she said. "We force them to come to us." Her plan was audacious and depended on perfect timing, but it might be their only chance. Using Jake's knowledge of the area and Sarah's understanding of how news organizations operated, they would create a crisis that would draw the kidnappers away from their stronghold and into a situation where the captives could escape. The first step was alerting the outside world to what was really happening in Cedar Ridge. Sarah used Jake's landline to call her editor in Denver, breaking her communication silence for the first time since her supposed death. The conversation had to be quick and careful, since they couldn't be sure the phone line wasn't monitored. "I need you to trust me and not ask questions," Sarah told her editor. "In exactly 6 hours, I need you to call the FBI field office in Denver and tell them you have reason to believe a terrorist cell is planning to contaminate the water supply for several rural Colorado communities. Give them these coordinates." She rattled off the location of the abandoned mine. "Sarah, you're supposed to be dead," her editor protested. "There were search teams, they found your belongings. I'll explain everything later, if we survive this. Just make that call in 6 hours, not before. And tell them to bring a hazmat team and enough agents to secure a large area. Lives depend on the timing being exact." The second part of their plan required Jake to contact Harold Barnes directly. The message would be simple but devastating. Jake had supposedly discovered evidence that Sarah hadn't actually drowned, and he was demanding an immediate meeting to renegotiate the terms of his cooperation. "He'll have to respond," Sarah explained. "If he thinks I'm still alive and potentially talking to authorities, he can't afford to ignore the threat. He'll either try to kill you immediately, or he'll want to find out exactly what you know before deciding how to handle the situation." Jake's hands shook slightly as he dialed Barnes' number. When the county commissioner answered, his voice was warm and friendly, just as it had always been. "Jake, how are you holding up? I heard about that poor journalist. Such a tragedy. We need to talk, Harold. Tonight. And we need to talk about Sarah Martinez." The silence that followed lasted so long that Jake wondered if the line had gone dead. When Barnes finally spoke, his voice was completely different. Cold, calculating, stripped of any pretense of friendship. "What about her?" "She didn't drown, Harold. She's alive, and she knows everything." Another long pause. "Where do you want to meet?" "The old oak tree on my property. You know the one. Come alone, and bring proof that my daughter and the others are still alive. We're going to renegotiate our arrangement." After Jake hung up, he and Sarah reviewed their timeline one more time. Barnes would almost certainly not come alone to the meeting, despite Jake's instructions. He would likely bring armed backup and position them around the oak tree before Jake arrived. What Barnes wouldn't expect was that Jake had no intention of actually going to the meeting location. Instead, Jake and Sarah would position themselves on a ridge overlooking the mine, watching for the moment when Barnes' people abandoned their posts to respond to what they perceived as a crisis at the ranch. With luck, the FBI response Sarah had arranged would arrive just as the kidnappers were realizing they had been outmaneuvered. As the sun set and their plan went into motion, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace despite the enormous risks they were taking. For the first time since this nightmare began, they weren't just reacting to their captors' moves. They were taking control of the situation and fighting back. The radio chatter that evening confirmed that their deception was working. Sarah heard urgent communications between Barnes and his associates as they coordinated their response to Jake's supposed betrayal. Vehicles were moving toward the ranch, leaving the mine with what sounded like a skeleton crew. At exactly the time Sarah had specified, FBI vehicles began appearing on the access road to the abandoned mine. The federal agents had taken her editor's warning about terrorist activity seriously and arrived in force. Through binoculars, Sarah and Jake watched as confusion erupted among the kidnappers still at the mine site. The endgame unfolded quickly. Caught between what they thought was a trap at Jake's ranch and an unexpected federal raid at their stronghold, Barnes' organization collapsed. Some of his people surrendered immediately when confronted by FBI agents, while others tried to flee and were captured within hours. Emma Morrison was found in an underground chamber that had once been used for equipment storage, along with 5 other captives who had been held for weeks. All were alive, though traumatized by their ordeal. The scale of Barnes' conspiracy was larger than even Sarah had suspected, involving corrupt officials in 3 counties and a development corporation that had been systematically acquiring land through intimidation and fraud. The story that emerged in the following weeks made national headlines. Sarah's resurrection from the dead became a symbol of investigative journalism's power to expose corruption, while Jake Morrison became an unlikely hero who had risked everything to save not just his daughter but an entire community. But, for Sarah, the most important moment came when she first saw Emma Morrison reunited with her father. The 16-year-old girl collapsed into Jake's arms, and both of them wept openly as months of fear and uncertainty finally came to an end. Standing in the shadow of the same oak tree where her adventure had begun, Sarah realized that sometimes the most important stories were the ones that almost never got told. Sometimes being bound beneath a tree and bracing for harm led to discoveries that changed everything. And, sometimes, the most shocking thing a person could do was simply choose to trust a stranger and fight for what was right. The truth, as Sarah had learned, was often more complex and more hope-filled than anyone could have imagined. And, sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually won.